You're back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And as we record this on Thursday, my anxiety about the nuclear and military security of the world is unabated by recent events. I also continue to experience a certain sense of wonderment that there isn't more of an organized left resistance to militarization, and perhaps here to enlighten me, certainly on the subject of military tensions and on what we can do about it. My next guest is Dr. Joseph Gerson. Joseph Gerson is the president of, let me make sure I get the entire title exactly right, the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. He is also vice president of the International Peace Bureau, which has won apparently a Nobel Peace Prize. And he's written several things recently that really struck me as very important. So without any further ado, Dr. Gerson, welcome to the Zero Hour.
Oh, thank you. And it's glad to, I'm glad to meet you and to work with you.
Same here. And, I mentioned in my opening remarks a certain sense of concern and perhaps even existential dread on my part. Am I misplaced to feel those concerns?
Absolutely not. I mean, we're in what's been described as a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. I think people have gotten accustomed to the war grinding on, have forgotten about Putin's nuclear threats. And the reality is that with the U.S. having changed its goals from defending Ukraine to severely weakening Russia, or the possibility of a total victory in Ukraine, these threaten the Russian state. A Russian nuclear doctrine is that when the Russian state is threatened existentially, it can use nuclear weapons. So we face the danger that up against the wall, say something like an Afghanistan-like bleeding of Russia, that Putin might resort to the use of one or more tactical nuclear weapons to terrorize Ukraine and enforce an end to the war, to try to enforce an end to the war on his terms. Then the question is, over and above all the damage, death, and devastation that would cause, what would be the response of the West? And you can read, actually, U.S. doctrine is that our nuclear arsenal is there not only to defend the vital interests of the United States and its allies, but also its partners. Ukraine is certainly at this juncture a partner, and we can read Henry Kissinger saying just the other day that we would have to respond to such an attack. So, I don't want to be saying that a nuclear war is likely, but it's certainly within the realms of possibility, and that should encourage us all the more to press in every way we can for ceasefire and a negotiated settlement to end this war.
And I've even seen commentary suggesting that an exchange of tactical nuclear weapons is not something we should shy away from. I think one of the things, having been around peace movements for many years, as of course you have, one of the things that's really stunned me about the present moment is we come from an era where it was clear that nuclear weaponry, exchanges of nuclear armaments could quickly escalate into a world catastrophic event. And it seems to me that fundamental lesson, which in this country, people across the political spectrum once understood, has been lost, and is we're almost walking in a dreamland now where we can engage in this kind of brinksmanship and even talk about the use of tactical nuclear weapons without understanding how that might escalate. First of all, it would be horrible in and of itself, but might escalate into something massively destructive.
I mean, almost all the war games that I'm aware of where tactical nuclear weapons have been used in the game playing, have escalated to essentially nuclear annihilation. So that's what we face. It's I'm as old as you are, I think, and it's been a bit striking to me that on several occasions as I've prepared for talks and made reference to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I was asked to explain what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that many people, given our education system and our culture, don't know about it. We have a new generation, and much of the more activist dimensions of that generation have focused on climate change, which is a very real existential threat, and social and economic injustice, which in a more limited way provide existential threats to individual people's lives. So I think if there is a silver lining to this disaster, it may be that it's beginning to awaken people to the dangers of nuclear war. I am reminded that at the end of just after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was a time when the Kennedy government believed the odds that we would move to a nuclear war, thermonuclear exchange, would rise to between a third and a half, which is to say the end of humanity. On the other side of that, sobered by the situation, Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated the limited test ban treaty, and one can hope that maybe there'll be some awakening now that can have some impacts going term. Actually, Kennedy was so sobered by it that he gave his famous speech at American University, which essentially was calling for an end to the Cold War, and which may have been the reason he was killed.
That's obviously another whole can of worms, as they say. One of the things, by the way, Joseph Gerson, I learned not long ago about John F. Kennedy's presidency, and I don't want to idealize him either, or all presidents have been complex people, but was that his intention was that the mission to the moon be reconfigured so that it was a joint U.S.-Soviet operation. And I'm sure you know that, but they were in negotiations to do that. And just imagine how the psychology of the Cold War might have been transformed by something like that. If in 1964, a living President Kennedy had said that we're now going to do this jointly with the Soviet Union. And it gets me to the whole question of the psychology of Cold War, which I feel we've returned to. Perhaps we never left it, but I feel that certainly the sort of liberal democratic wing of the spectrum is perhaps not as aware of the pitfalls of it as it had been. And one of the things that had me thinking about that was your letter to the editor, which actually my wife spotted, being a wise person, and sent to me. It was a letter to the editor that begins, I had to stop reading James Traub. He's a reviewer. His review of Jeffrey Frank's book, The Trials of Harry S. Truman, to regain a sense of proportion. And excuse me for quoting you at length, but at a time when so many are demanding that Vladimir Putin be tried as a war criminal, ... Traub praises Truman's ability to make the quote-unquote tough calls of obliterating Hiroshima and Nagasaki along with their civilian populations. I should preface this by saying my mother actually visited Nagasaki not long after the bombing. She was with the occupation forces in the USO, the entertainment she was an actress, but I was literally raised on the horror of the destruction of Nagasaki. She developed cancer later and so on. But it seems to me that I don't know much about Jeffrey Frank or his book, but it seems to me that you were performing an invaluable service here with this letter, which is hitting a pause button. It seems from the left to the right in the mainstream, party politics, everybody admires the tough calls of killing civilians nowadays, and nobody's stopping to think about the hypocrisy, the double standard, and the threat underlying it. Am I misperceiving the zeitgeist or whatever in thinking that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and we want to have a rose-colored glasses view of ourselves in our history, and we're also, if you will, an anti-historical people. So in this country, we don't hold on to historical memory. I mean, clearly we have to be condemning Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the killing that went with it. But just think about how we took much of Mexico in a brutal imperial conquest. The history of the creation of what really is a U.S. empire, and too often we've had liberals. We mentioned Kennedy, who put U.S. forces into Vietnam, then Lyndon Johnson, and the massive escalation of that war. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton carries some degree of responsibility for the current crisis and war. Again, historical memory is gone, but in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War in the 1990s, there were a number of really critical agreements made in the tradition of common security, in the tradition you were referencing of Kennedy wanting to have Russians join us going to the moon. So you had the Paris Charter, you had the U.S.-NATO Founding Act, and you had the 1999 OSCE agreement, all of which said that no nation involved, basically from the United States and Canada across Russia, would seek to improve its security at the expense of others. And there had been the commitments by Scowcroft under Bush to say that NATO wouldn't move a centimeter closer to Moscow. So we need to think here. It was Clinton who broke those agreements and commitments by beginning to expand NATO toward Russia's border. There were other ways that the security of Eastern European countries that had been under the yoke of the Soviet Union could have achieved security. Then we don't want to be too self-centered, right? So we have to appreciate who the other is, what their perceptions are, and for Russia, their historical memory, as deep for them as, say, Washington crossing the Delaware, was the reality of Napoleon's invasion of Russia from the West, the Kaiser's invasion of Russia from the West, Hitler's invasion of Russia from the West. At the cost of tens of millions of people. So they were perceiving the West encroaching on them. We've already had not only U.S. but also German troops on the Russian border. So from their perception was that they were becoming increasingly strategically vulnerable to attack from the West. From their perspective, in addition to the kind of pan-Slavic Russian ambitions to control countries that have Russian and Slavic populations, they were moving to they were invading to remove a threat to their security as they perceived it. Again, we have to unfortunately think in terms of U.S. history, where the United States has done this over and over and over again. Who here remembers Grenada? Who here remembers the Contra Wars? It's been a constant. And I think the challenge for us, and we do it with our organization, common security dimension of it, is to be exploring how we can coexist with other countries, what kind of foundations of peace there can be. And we had an excellent model of this in the very early 1980s at the height of the Cold War, when the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme brought together leading figures from the Soviet Union, from Europe, from the United States, Canada, and they developed the Common Security Report, whose basic foundation was that no nation can be secure if its rival is not, and you have to do the hard negotiations to remove fears on both sides. That report, along with the popular movements of the time, led to the negotiation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement in 1987 that functionally ended the Cold War before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'm happy to be able to say that amidst all of this, in February, just before the Russian invasion, the Olof Palme Foundation, along with the International Peace Bureau and the International Trade Union Confederation, with something like 200 million members, issued a new Common Security 2022 report that we're trying to get out into the world.
Well, I think that's tremendously important. And by the way, Olof Palme, Prime Minister of Sweden, talking about unsolved assassinations, right? It is interesting and tragic how that seems to work out. But he did such important and work in this area. And it gets me to, Dr. Gerson, another point that, no matter how many times it seems that you or I or any of us preface our remarks with, Putin has committed war crimes and his actions are morally indefensible in that sense, there seems to be a resistance to the idea that, as somebody once said, that the very purpose of a negotiation is to talk to your enemies, not your friends, is to talk to people you are opposed to, and that the alternative is eventually going to be a military confrontation when you have the world's two nuclear superpowers being on both sides of that confrontation. It's not going to end well. Now, in the 1980s, which you referenced, eventually, even under Ronald Reagan, we had what seemed to be a receptive atmosphere to the idea of negotiation. And now it seems as if negotiation in a lot of quarters is a dirty word. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Yeah. No, we have this, you have a long history of American exceptionalism. You go deep in our history to the idea that the early colonists were creating a city on a hill, the idea that we were bringing goodness into the world. And a long history of finding enemies in ways that increase our power, right? So clearly negotiations are the way forward. And beyond the situation of Ukraine, I mean, the reality is, and again, where culture needs to catch up with reality, is the greatest danger looking into the medium and the long term are U.S.-China relations, the military and economic confrontations that are going on, and ways in which this has really removed the cooperation, the diplomacy that's necessary to address the climate crisis, which is going to impact the Chinese and the Americans in devastating ways. And it's interesting. I mean, one way of looking at the change of U.S. doctrine here in relationship to the Ukraine war is that part of the reason to be weakening Russia is not only to reduce its possible threats to Europe in the future, but that also will make it easier for the U.S. to increase the concentration of its all-government efforts to contain China. People need to begin to understand that negotiations over Taiwan right now are in some ways critical to human survival, because Taiwan has really become the hinge of a primary struggle between the United States and China. Taiwan remaining outside of Chinese control has become essential to U.S. control and domination of the Asia Pacific. Essentially, there was the domino theory in the past, but in this case, we've got something very close to that.
And I'm so glad you brought up China, Dr. Gerson, because it seems to me I've been struck by the Biden administration's bellicosity of rhetoric toward China. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me this is a country that never displayed, unlike Russia, never seemed, as far as I knew, to display any desire to invest in making itself a military threat to us. It seems to me we're being bellicose about what it had been, at least primarily an economic threat. And one thing, for example, I don't know what the final number was, but when I last looked at the draft military budget, the latest draft military budget, of course, they keep adding tens of billions of dollars to it. But for example, it included $3.9 billion for military exercises and other maneuvers in the South China Sea. And it seems to me if China were investing $3.9 billion in maneuvers in the Pacific off the coast of California, we'd be pretty upset about it. So it seems to me as if we're trying to provoke them into some sort of new armaments race. But am I being paranoid?
No, we're already there. Graham Allison at Harvard wrote a book several years ago about the Thucydides trap, the historical pattern of tensions and conflict between rising and declining powers. And this describes the situation between the U.S. and China precisely. Again, to be a bit of an iconoclast here, while the war in Europe, the Second World War, was one thing, the war in the Pacific was something else. It was a contest between competing empires: the United States, Japan, and Britain. The U.S. had established its empire there beginning in 1898, and at the end of that war, U.S. won. The Pacific became an American lake, and it served as the foundation for U.S. dominance of Asia Pacific now for 75 years. What's happened is that with China's economic rise, that total U.S. domination is in question, and they're rising technologically, they're rising economically. The United States has China surrounded by several hundred military bases. They are thinking, I think, increasingly on the one hand in terms of defense, and part of that defense, I think they're also thinking in terms of a sphere of influence. I mean, not unlike the Monroe Doctrine here.
Right.
They don't like having a big superpower on their border. So you've had, really beginning with Obama and the pivot to Asia, a U.S. escalation of military competition. And it's interesting, if you go back, William Perry was the Secretary of Defense under Clinton. And in 1996, there was an election in Taiwan, and the Chinese were not happy that the independence forces might win there. So they did some untoward things. And Perry's response was to send two aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Straits, with all of the incredible threat that conveys. The Chinese were somewhat panicked, and that led to their decision to have massive investment in modernizing their military, so they wouldn't be defenseless against the United States. So we're now in an arms race, and we have very little diplomatic engagement with China right now. So it's critically important for us to be encouraging negotiations and a kind of common security arrangement with China. Let there be competition, but it doesn't have to be military.
Well, absolutely. And it seems to me, one thing I've puzzled about, Joseph Gerson, throughout this whole, watching this unfold with China, and we're not saying the Chinese are saints, but they just saw no need to invest in military. They had other investments they wanted to make, and but we pushed them into it. It seems to me that when you're dealing with a rising economic empire, a growing economic empire like China's, it seems to me that, among other things, this militarized response is both wildly dangerous and, it seems to me, completely ineffectual, because it doesn't seem like as if aircraft carriers are going to do anything to stop China's growing economic influence. So it almost seems to me like a gesture of futility. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we're wasting resources in a military competition. But more, like with the First World War, it's like we're sleepwalking into a major war, and we need to be aware. I mean, with the provocative military exercises that you were referencing in the South China Sea, and China does its share as well, but its navy is not nearly as big or powerful as the United States, and we're now joined by the British and the French and the Japanese. But in those circumstances, it's all too easy to have an accident or miscalculation that could trigger an escalation. And the same is true around Taiwan, where both sides are engaging in very provocative actions. I will say that I think one of the most profound mistakes that the Biden administration has made has been its campaign now to undercut the one China policy. I mean, the U.S. and Chinese relations were restored fully in 1979 with the agreement that the United States recognized only one China, and that was inclusive of Taiwan. And over time now, it's gotten, the U.S. has encouraged more independence-related forces. But now you've got the Biden administration beginning with its inauguration, inviting the pseudo-Taiwanese ambassador to attend, increased arms sales, and most recently and most troubling, the State Department's fact sheet on Taiwan has removed its reference to opposing Taiwanese independence, so this is Taiwan really has become, I think, the hinge point of history, and we have to be encouraging negotiations between Taiwan and China rather than pouring oil on the fire.
And it seems to me, I mean, if this is not an apt comparison, let me know, but it seems to me, whatever the struggles there have been in Hong Kong, at least there was a way forward that didn't involve open warfare.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, China is an authoritarian nation.
Sure,
it is engaged in brutal repression, not only in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, but people more domestically as well. But we haven't seen preparations to invade the United States because we have 2 million people in our prisons, mostly people of color. So that's right. Kind of an accident, right? So even with the situation, the Cold War, U.S. and Russia, where again you had vast differences over human rights, and understandably so, negotiations went forward. There were negotiations and agreements in terms of strategic arms limitation treaties and more. So, we're not going to be able to conquer the world. It's not all there for the United States. It's hard for us to accept this. And we have to find ways to coexist with other countries, to recognize that people in China, people in Russia have to be the ones who will determine their own future. I mean, I've been very privileged. I've been working amidst the war here with both people, very courageous people in Russia who've been opposing the war, and leaving communications open with some people rather high in the Russian elite, hearing what they have to say and seeing ways that we can nudge towards some kind of negotiated peace.
And people forget that Volodymyr Zelensky was a peace candidate when he originally ran for president, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he wanted to negotiate with the Russians. And again, we get some very complicated, murky stuff, which is not being well reported on. So, Ukraine, try to look at a map of Ukraine over the last 500 years. I mean, it's constantly changing. Ukraine was once part of the Lithuanian Empire, of all things. So you have this reality that we don't want to face. You also have very hard right-wing forces in Ukraine, and there's speculation, I can't prove it, that once he came to power, Zelensky was under tremendous pressure from the right not to make any concessions from with the Russians in the Donbass area, maybe at the risk of his life.
Right.
So we've got a number of forces here. It's not only the great men and the celebrities that we see on TV, but there are other forces that work in all of our societies.
Right, absolutely. So, it's not a fair question, Joseph Gerson, in a way, but, I keep thinking, what's the way forward in all of this? And in your comment on the review of the Truman book, I guess the reviewer used the phrase unterrified democracy. I think if you're unterrified in this nuclear armed world, you're not paying attention because it's pretty terrifying. But other than, fighting the good fight in terms of, pushing back on that narrative, you're doing work, for example, you mentioned in common security and working with Russian peace forces, which I think is great. What can people do to be more aware of this, maybe to get involved themselves, fight the good fight on this?
Well, so, most basically, people have got to open their eyes and ears and get beyond Fox television, right? So there's lots of sources. Our webpage, cpdcs.org, is one. There's all kinds of media out there. Democracy Now!, your program. But I think also, democracy only works when people work at it. It's not delivered like a TV dinner. So if we want peace candidates running for Congress, then we've got to we've got to find them. We've got to support them. We've got to go knocking on their doors. We need to write those letters to the editor to educate our neighbors. In our churches, in our communities. I mean, there's a movement by physicians for social responsibility, right? To try to move us back from the nuclear brink. People can go to the website Back from the Brink, find the resolution, take it to your city council, take it to your church or your synagogue or your mosque, and encourage it to be adopted and sent on to your members of Congress. It takes the daily work here to make the change, and hopefully we also you're in the Washington D.C. area. Who knows who in Washington is listening to this, and perhaps we change some minds just as a function of result of discourse.
Well, I can't add anything to that. I think that's tremendously important and tremendously helpful. Again, my guest, Joseph Gerson, is the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. It can be found at cpdcs.org. So, Dr. Gerson, thanks for all your great work in this area, and thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to have you. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.